The red button scenario is a thought experiment that comes from Efilism. It resembles the benevolent world exploder, which is a conclusion of negative utilitarianism that has been used to argue against it, appealing to it as a repugnant conclusion. Similar conclusions, it seems, belong to other ethical theories as well. The first time I have encountered it, it was presented as a thought experiment where you have a red button in front of you that you can press, and if you do press it, you will instantaneously and painlessly annihilate all sentient life on Earth. My answer was that the right thing to do is to press it, and it still is. That's not because there's nothing bad in killing. Indeed, pressing the red button would entail very bad aspects due to the imposition of death, but I think it would be worse to let all that suffering be experienced. The good of preventing all future suffering, including the most excruciating pain and horrible panic and fear, prevails on the bad of imposing death if it doesn't require imposing serious suffering as well, at least to any sufficiently innocent individual. So, this is one of those rare cases of sacrifice, maybe the only one, that theoretically I consider to be justified. The red button doesn't belong to anti-natalism, despite the fact that the atheists have been associating the two things. Actually, my answer would have been the same even before becoming anti-natalist, knowing some of the extreme suffering that exists on this planet. There are other anti-natalists who don't give the same answer that I do and are not less anti-natalist than me. This thought experiment pushes the circumstances to the extreme in a way that is not realistic, and so that if you don't press the button, you are responsible of wasting the opportunity to prevent a multitude of individuals from experiencing all sorts of suffering, including the most intense and prolonged physical pain and the worst mental distress, when you could have so easily prevented it, even though you have to kill all the existing sentient beings. This is the strategy behind this thought experiment. It's that of making you think that you are responsible either ways. So not only if you decide to kill all sentient beings, but also if you decide not to. It investigates, it gives you a clue on the importance that you attribute to the prevention of suffering. It challenges your morality on the concept of sacrifice and its ethical boundaries, and it makes you consider killing and exterminating as a solution to the problem of suffering on Earth. The atheists think that the red button scenario is realistic. They think it is possible to exterminate all sentient life on Earth, and that's actually their goal. They think it's possible to convince enough people, or the right people, to do that at some point, and they think it's possible to build a technology that makes it happen, even though they are yet to tell how that would be possible exactly. Some atheists think that it would be justified and worth it even if sentient life wouldn't become extinct as a consequence. They think that human beings have a duty to build the red button, so to speak, and to get as close as possible to the extinction of sentient life, even if inflicting serious suffering towards innocent individuals is necessary. What the atheists seem to ignore is the fact that this is not a realistic scenario. It is very unlikely, to say the least. It's actually impossible, especially if we assume that it can kill 100% of sentient beings on Earth instantaneously and painlessly. But even without these conditions, it would be impossible to convince people to attempt the extermination of sentient life. But let's say that is not true and humanity gets convinced to go along with the atheist goal. Let's say the human population has scaled down, humans have stopped breeding animals, and a large part of the animals in the wild, the big animals, have been reduced. It would not be possible to engineer sentient life extinction through sterilizing wild animals or through killing them via chemicals or by other means. It would not be possible to pollute, poison, and in general to transform the environment in such a way that it becomes sterile and inhabitable. The most effective way to attempt extermination, as said many times by the atheists, would be through nuclear weapons. So let's say that you can use all the uranium and all the available material to create the biggest explosion possible. And let's say that you can position them into volcanoes or whatever area would create the most destruction possible. Even then, you wouldn't kill all sentient beings, and obviously you wouldn't eliminate all the resource. There are animals who would continue living, at least in the deep oceans, but probably not only them. Sentient life would definitely keep evolving, flourishing, and it would end up colonizing the surface of the planet again. And you might even end up not having prevented a utilitarian amount of suffering, because after that things might get worse than before. The life that will emerge might be so bad in the mechanisms of quantity of harm caused that it might even cover the harm that would have existed without attempting extermination. Even the mass extinction that killed the dinosaurs didn't do much good. For a time there were less animals living and reproducing on Earth, but then more smaller animals appeared. Another aspect of this extermination attempt is that there is no way of doing that without imposing serious suffering. It would entail the imposition of extreme terror and extreme physical pain. The Ephilists think that it would be justified. They used to say that there is no cost that is too high for the prevention of such a big amount of suffering. They say inflicting just about any amount of suffering is justified in this case. But it is inevitable because it's impossible to have a bomb that would make everything explode everywhere at the same time in the same way. Even if, let's say, there were just the 20% of the number of sentient beings existing now on Earth, those 20% would not be confined in the same place. They would be disseminated around the globe so that there's no way of killing them all at the same time instantaneously. Not all of them would be close enough to the source of the explosion for them to die instantaneously. Some of them would be in a periphery of the explosions. Some will not be touched from them. They would die for the consequences of those explosions, depending on how far they are. Only the ones that are close enough will die instantaneously and painlessly. But those who are at a bigger distance will see the explosion coming, for example. They will be terrified before being hit by the explosions. From a bigger distance, they will be hit by a shock wave or by heat, fire, radiations, but that will not be instantaneous. So they would get injured and they would be agonizing before dying. Those who would survive the explosions will die due to different consequences. They will die of cancer due to the radioactive material. They will die of cold, disease, starvation, and that's because of the nuclear winter that that comes. There will be so much suffering involved. There are too many negative effects of this kind of intervention in reality that would make it just unjustifiable. Now that I have addressed the likelihood of having an instantaneous and painless total extermination of sentient life on Earth and its ethics, let's talk about how likely it is to convince human beings to do it. How do the atheists think they can convince whole human beings to do that? Uh, there have been atheists saying that they don't need to convince whole human beings in order to reach their goal. So I guess they think they only need to convince enough people, like there's a critical percentage, or maybe it's a matter of what country gets convinced the most. I mean, maybe it depends on how powerful is the country with the biggest number of atheists in it. So maybe they think one of the most powerful country would be just enough in order to impose it to everyone else. They might need to go to war then, and maybe they could even win this war if the athletes ones are the most powerful ones. But the truth is, you cannot convince enough people anywhere. That is not possible. Why? I will go straight to the very core of the motivation why that is not possible. The reason is that human beings, just as any sentient beings, are fundamentally selfish because each one feels only throughout their own body and not everyone else's body. So even though human beings are intelligent enough to understand many things and to be aware of the existence of other sentient beings, and they do that at a sufficient level to have this kind of ethical reasoning and stuff like that, perceived self-interest is and will remain fundamentally more influential on humanity compared with ethical thinking. I'm not saying that there have been no moral improvement in history. I'm not saying there will be no more moral improvement in the future. What I'm saying is that any moral improvement for humans are always driven by self-interest. This is an insuperable limit of any ethical implementation in any human society. The majority of human beings would never even contemplate it as an altruistic thing, especially something like this, which is so repugnant for most people. It is just too hard to overcome that perception and to engage in the thought process necessary to think about the reasons why that could be the right thing to do. But given the things that I said earlier, I have to say it is better this way. It doesn't matter how hard the atheists will try to push that, and how intricate and clever will be the strategy, they will not convince them. All what this thought experiment and atheism in general can do is to convince a few people that killing is a good idea. It can incite some crazy people to harm and kill human beings, and it can push some shallow thinking people to kill wild animals, likely causing terror and extreme pain to them before causing their death, and without even reducing any suffering, since the red bottom scenario cannot be scaled down to real smaller scenarios, those animals will just be replaced by others.